Welcome to Uniquely Spoken Podcast, empowering healthcare, where transparency sparks transformation. Are you ready to dive into conversations that will spark ideas and inspire action? This is a podcast that refuses to accept the status quo. Welcome back to Empowering Healthcare, where transparency sparks transformation. Picture this. It's 6:45 in the morning at a 120-bed skilled nursing facility. The director of nursing has already been in the building for 2 hours, not because she wants to be, but because she has 3 call-offs on the day shift, 1 resignation letter sitting on her desk that she hasn't had time to process, and an agency nurse walking in the door who has never set foot in this building before. By 7 a.m., she's not thinking about care plans. She's not thinking about quality improvement initiatives. She's thinking about one thing: how do I get through today? Now, here's the part that should stop us all in our tracks. This isn't a crisis. This is Tuesday. This is the normal operating condition for thousands of long-term care facilities across the country. And here's what's even more troubling. Most organizations have gotten so good at surviving this chaos that they've stopped asking the one question that actually matters. Not how do we fill this shift, but why does this shift keep opening up in the first place? This is episode 23, The Turnover Trap: Why Long-Term Care Keeps Solving Staffing Problems the Wrong Way. I'm your host, and today we're talking about the turnover trap: why long-term care keeps solving the same staffing crisis over and over again, and why the solution almost everyone reaches for is the very thing keeping the crisis alive. Let's start with a number that should be sitting uncomfortably with every administrator listening right now. Turnover in long-term care nursing staff has, in many markets, hovered between 40 and 100% annually, depending on the role and the region. For certified nursing assistants specifically, some facilities cycle through the equivalent of their entire CNA workforce more than once a year. Let that sink in. Not a fraction of the workforce, the entire workforce, sometimes twice. And yet, when boards and ownership groups ask, what's our biggest operational risk, turnover rarely gets named directly. Instead, we hear about census. We hear about reimbursement rates. We hear about survey readiness. Turnover is treated like weather, something unpleasant that happens to you, not something you have real influence over. That's the first myth we need to dismantle today. Turnover is not weather. It is not random. And it is not simply a symptom of a tight labor market. It is, in most organizations, a predictable output of specific identifiable conditions that leadership has far more control over than the industry likes to admit. The second myth we need to address is about cost. Ask most administrators what turnover costs them, and you'll get an answer about the price of agency staffing or the cost of a job posting. But the real cost of turnover is layered, and most of it never appears on a line item labeled turnover. It shows up as a fall that didn't get caught because the aide covering the hall didn't know the resident's history. It shows up as a medication error during a shift staffed by someone on their 3rd agency assignment that week. It shows up in a survey citation for a care plan that wasn't followed, not because anyone was negligent, but because nobody who wrote the plan was still in the building to execute it. Turnover isn't a staffing problem wearing a budget disguise. It's a leadership and systems problem wearing a staffing disguise. And today, we're going to pull that disguise off. Let's talk about where most organizations put their energy, because it reveals a lot about where they think the problem lives. Walk into almost any long-term care leadership meeting and ask, what are we doing about staffing? The answer almost always starts with recruitment, job fairs, sign-on bonuses, partnerships with nursing schools, streamlined applications, faster onboarding. All of that has value. None of it is wrong. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Recruitment fixes the front door. Retention fixes the back door. And if your back door is wide open, it doesn't matter how many people you bring in through the front. You're just increasing the speed of the revolving door, not stopping it. Here's a scenario many administrators will recognize. A facility hires 10 new CNAs in a single quarter after an aggressive recruitment push. Leadership celebrates the win. Ownership is pleased. But 6 months later, 7 of those 10 are gone. Nobody asks why. The narrative becomes CNAs are just hard to find these days. And the facility launches another recruitment campaign. What almost never happens is a serious internal audit asking, what happened to those 7 people between hire date and exit date? Did they receive adequate orientation? Did they have a mentor? Did their schedule match what they were promised? Did they feel supported when a resident situation escalated? Did anyone in leadership know their name by week 3? Recruitment answers, how do we get people in the door? Retention answers, why do people stay? And an organization that only invests in the first question will keep paying for the same seats over and over again, often at a higher and higher price, because agencies and referral bonuses are not cheap. This brings us to agency staffing, which deserves its own honest conversation, because agency staff are not the villain here, but over-reliance on them absolutely is a symptom worth examining. Agency staffing exists for a reason. It fills gaps. It provides flexibility during surges. In a genuine emergency, it can be the difference between safe staffing and an unsafe shift. Used sparingly and strategically, it's a legitimate tool. The problem is what happens when agency staffing stops being the exception and becomes the operating model. When a facility is scheduling agency nurses not for occasional coverage, but as a permanent fixture on the schedule, that facility has quietly redefined temporary solution as standard practice. And that redefinition comes with real costs. Consider the financial side first. Agency rates routinely run at 2 to 3 times the hourly cost of a staff employee once you factor in agency fees. Facilities that lean heavily on agency staffing are often spending far more than it would cost to pay competitive wages, offer meaningful shift differentials, or build out a robust internal float pool. Yet the money keeps flowing to agencies because the crisis feels too immediate to invest in a longer-term fix. Then there's the operational side. Agency staff, through no fault of their own, don't know the building. They don't know that Mr. Alvarez in room 214 gets agitated if his water pitcher isn't on his left side. They don't know that the call light system on the second floor has a delay. They don't know which residents have subtle but important behavioral baselines that would tip off a familiar caregiver that something is wrong today. That knowledge, the kind that prevents falls, catches early signs of infection, and de-escalates behavioral episodes before they become incidents, lives in relationships built over time. Agency staffing, by its transient nature, cannot build that knowledge base, no matter how skilled the individual clinician is. And finally, there's the cultural cost. Permanent staff notice when the schedule is dominated by unfamiliar faces. It sends an unspoken message. This team is not stable. That instability breeds anxiety, reduces trust between coworkers, and this is the part leadership often misses, actually accelerates turnover among the permanent staff who are left holding the institutional knowledge while orienting a rotating cast of strangers, shift after shift. The organizations that break this cycle tend to treat agency usage as a diagnostic tool rather than a staffing plan. If agency hours are climbing, the right question isn't, how do we get more agency coverage? It's, what is happening internally that's driving this dependency, and what would it take to solve that root cause instead? Now let's talk about one of the most underused resources sitting in almost every long-term care HR file cabinet, the exit interview. Most facilities conduct them. Fewer facilities read them with any rigor. And a shockingly small number actually act on the patterns those interviews reveal. Here's why this matters so much. An exit interview is one of the only moments in the employment relationship where an employee has almost nothing left to lose by being honest. They're leaving. They don't need to manage a relationship with their supervisor anymore. This is, in many cases, the most truthful feedback an organization will ever receive. And it often gets filed away, unread, in a folder that exists mainly to demonstrate compliance rather than drive change. Think about the pattern that emerges when you actually aggregate exit interview data across a facility, a region, or a company. If 15 employees over the course of a year all mention feeling unsupported during difficult resident situations, that's not 15 isolated personal grievances. That's a systemic gap in training or supervisory support. If a recurring theme is, I never saw my manager on the floor, that's not a scheduling footnote. That's a visibility and leadership presence problem. If multiple departing staff cite short staffing as the reason they left, and yet the facility's response to short staffing is to lean harder on the remaining staff rather than address root causes, the exit interviews are essentially predicting the next round of departures before they happen. The organizations that treat exit interviews as a strategic asset rather than a paperwork requirement do a few things differently. They look for patterns across multiple interviews rather than treating each one as an isolated data point. They separate the exit interview process from the departing employee's direct supervisor whenever possible, because people are far more candid with someone who isn't their boss. And critically, they bring these findings into leadership meetings not as a compliance report, but as a strategic input, the same way they would review survey results or financial performance. If your exit interviews are telling you the same story quarter after quarter and nothing changes, the data isn't the problem. Now, we've talked about frontline staff turnover, but there's a layer above that which often gets less attention and does disproportionate damage. Leadership turnover, particularly at the director of nursing and administrator level. Here's a scenario that plays out with striking regularity across the industry. A facility brings in a new administrator, or DON. That leader begins to build trust with the team, starts initiatives around scheduling fairness, mentorship, or recognition, and begins to see early signs of stabilization. Then, 12 to 18 months in, that leader leaves, sometimes due to burnout, sometimes recruited elsewhere, sometimes due to corporate restructuring. A new leader comes in, and the cycle resets. Staff who were just beginning to trust the direction the facility was heading now have to recalibrate, wondering whether this new leader's priorities will stick or whether they too will be gone within the year. This is sometimes called the revolving door at the top, and its damage is disproportionate to its frequency. Frontline staff can tolerate turnover among peers with relative resilience because it's a familiar pattern. But when leadership itself is unstable, staff begin to internalize a much more corrosive belief. Nobody in charge here is going to be around long enough to actually fix anything. So why should I invest my energy in this place either? Leadership turnover also has a direct line to regulatory performance. Survey readiness, care plan consistency, and quality improvement initiatives all depend on continuity of oversight. A Don who is new to a building doesn't yet know where the quiet risks are hiding. The care plan that's technically compliant, but not actually being followed. The documentation habit that's been drifting for months. The resident whose family has been quietly escalating concerns that never made it up the chain. Institutional memory walks out the door with every departing leader, and it takes months, sometimes longer, to rebuild. The facilities that manage to avoid this trap tend to invest heavily in leadership development from within, building a bench of future DONs and administrators who already understand the culture, the residents, and the community, rather than repeatedly going external and starting from zero. Let's bring these threads together and talk about what an unfilled position actually costs, because the number most organizations use, the direct cost of recruiting and onboarding a replacement, dramatically understates the real picture. Financially, yes, there's the recruitment cost, the onboarding cost, and often the elevated agency spend that bridges the gap. But there's also overtime paid to remaining staff who are covering extra shifts, which compounds fatigue and increases the odds that they too will eventually leave. There's the cost of increased incident reporting, which can affect liability exposure and insurance premiums over time. There's the cost of survey citations tied to staffing-related deficiencies, which can trigger everything from plans of correction to reputational damage that affects future census and referrals. Operationally, a vacancy means the remaining team is stretched thinner, which means less time for the kind of relationship-based care that catches problems early. It means training and mentorship for newer staff gets deprioritized because everyone is in survival mode, which sets up the next wave of turnover among the people who just started. And in terms of resident care, this is where the cost becomes most serious. Continuity of caregiving is one of the strongest predictors of positive outcomes in long-term care. Residents who see familiar faces experience less anxiety, communicate concerns more readily, and are more likely to have subtle changes in condition noticed early. When vacancies force constant staffing churn, that continuity breaks down, and the resident, the person this entire system exists to serve, absorbs the consequence. It's worth pausing to connect turnover explicitly to the outcomes leadership cares most about, because these connections are often discussed in silos rather than as a single interconnected system. Resident outcomes suffer when continuity of care is disrupted. Increased fall risk, missed early warning signs of decline, medication errors during rushed or unfamiliar shifts, and diminished quality of life for residents who crave the comfort of familiar caregivers. Staff morale erodes under chronic understaffing as remaining employees absorb extra shifts, experience compassion fatigue, and begin to doubt leadership's ability or willingness to fix the underlying problem. Team communication breaks down when shift-to-shift handoffs happen between unfamiliar staff and agency personnel who lack context on resident history, care plan nuances, and family dynamics, increasing the risk of critical information falling through the cracks. Regulatory performance suffers as documentation consistency slips, care plans drift from actual practice, and survey teams identify staffing-related deficiencies that can trigger deeper scrutiny of the entire operation. Organizational culture shifts from one of stability and shared purpose to one of survival mode, where the operating question becomes, how do we get through today, rather than how do we deliver excellent care? And that shift, once entrenched, becomes very difficult to reverse. Every one of these dimensions feeds the others. Poor morale drives more turnover. More turnover weakens communication. Weakened communication increases regulatory risk. Regulatory risk damages reputation, which makes recruitment harder. It's a closed loop, and the only way out is to interrupt it at its root rather than treating each symptom in isolation. So where does real change begin? Based on what consistently distinguishes organizations that break the turnover cycle from those that remain trapped in it. A few themes stand out. First, leaders who are visible on the floor change the trajectory of a building. Staff consistently report that knowing their DON or administrator by name, seeing them during a difficult shift, and feeling that leadership understands the day-to-day reality of the work builds a level of trust that no policy memo can replicate. Second, state interviews are as valuable as exit interviews and far too rare. Instead of only learning why people leave, effective leaders proactively ask current high performers why they stay and what would make them consider leaving. This surfaces retention risk before they become resignation letters. Third, onboarding is a retention strategy, not an administrative formality. The first 90 days determine an enormous share of whether a new hire stays for years or leaves within months. Facilities that assign structured mentorship check in deliberately at 30, 60, and 90 days and set realistic expectations up front see measurably stronger retention among new staff. Fourth, scheduling fairness and predictability matter more than most compensation strategies alone. Employees who feel that scheduling decisions are transparent, equitable, and made with respect for their personal lives are significantly more likely to stay, even in markets where a competitor might offer marginally higher pay. Fifth, recognition has to be specific and consistent, not sporadic and generic. A pizza party after a rough survey doesn't address the daily experience of feeling unseen. Meaningful recognition ties directly to the actual behaviors and sacrifices staff are making. And it happens regularly, not just during crisis moments or designated appreciation weeks. Let's translate this into a concrete set of actions leadership can begin implementing without waiting for a new budget cycle. Audit your current turnover data by role, shift, and tenure. Not just an overall percentage, but a breakdown that reveals where the bleeding is actually happening. Is it concentrated in the first 90 days, on a specific shift, among a specific supervisor's team? Bring exit interview data into leadership meetings as a standing agenda item, reviewed with the same seriousness as financial or survey performance, and assign clear ownership for acting on recurring themes. Implement stay interviews with your highest performers on a quarterly basis, asking directly what's working, what's frustrating, and what would make them consider leaving. Build a structured onboarding and mentorship program with defined check-in points at 30, 60, and 90 days, rather than relying on informal shadowing that varies wildly by supervisor. Let's translate this into a concrete set of actions leadership can begin implementing without waiting for a new budget cycle. Audit your current turnover data by role, shift, and tenure. Not just an overall percentage, but a breakdown that reveals where the bleeding is actually happening. Is it concentrated in the first 90 days, on a specific shift, among a specific supervisor's team? Bring exit interview data into leadership meetings as a standing agenda item, reviewed with the same seriousness as financial or survey performance, and assign clear ownership for acting on recurring themes. Implement stay interviews with your highest performers on a quarterly basis, asking directly what's working, what's frustrating, and what would make them consider leaving. Build a structured onboarding and mentorship program with defined check-in points at 30, 60, and 90 days, rather than relying on informal shadowing that varies wildly by supervisor. Set an internal benchmark for acceptable agency usage and treat any sustained deviation above that benchmark as a trigger for root cause investigation, not simply a scheduling gap to fill. Invest in an internal leadership pipeline, identifying and developing future DONs, supervisors, and administrators from within your existing staff so that leadership transitions don't require starting from zero each time. Increase leadership visibility on the floor, particularly during high-stress shifts, weekends, and off hours, when staff most need to know someone in leadership understands what they're experiencing. Review scheduling practices for fairness and predictability, and involve frontline staff directly in identifying friction points in the current system. None of these require a massive capital investment. They require sustained leadership attention and a willingness to treat retention as a strategic priority rather than an HR afterthought. Let's consolidate what we've covered into the core points every leader listening should carry forward. Turnover in long-term care is not an inevitable byproduct of a tight labor market. It is, in large part, a predictable outcome of specific organizational conditions that leadership has real power to influence. Recruitment and retention are not the same strategy, and an organization that only invests in the former will keep refilling the same open positions indefinitely. Agency staffing is a legitimate tool in moderation, but when it becomes the default operating model, it signals and compounds a deeper retention failure. Exit interviews contain some of the most honest and actionable data an organization will ever collect, and ignoring the patterns within them all but guarantees the same departures will repeat. Leadership turnover carries outsized consequences for culture, continuity, and regulatory performance, and deserves the same strategic attention as frontline retention. The true cost of a vacancy extends far beyond the price of filling it. It touches financial performance, operational stability, and most importantly, the safety and quality of life of the residents in your care. Sustainable change comes from addressing root causes, visibility, fairness, onboarding, recognition, and leadership stability, rather than continuously refilling the same open seats. As we close, let's focus on some insights. Here's the truth we need to sit with as we close today's episode. Every open position on your schedule is not simply a gap to be filled. It's a message. It's telling you something about what happened before that seat became empty. And if you don't listen to that message, you will find yourself filling that same seat again and again and again. The organizations that break free from the turnover trap are not the ones with the biggest recruitment budgets or the flashiest sign-on bonuses. They're the ones willing to ask the harder question, not how do we get someone in this role, but why does this role keep becoming vacant? And what are we actually willing to change about how we lead, support, and value the people doing this work? That question is uncomfortable. It requires leadership to look inward rather than outward. But it is also the only question that leads to a different outcome than the one your organization is currently living. Long-term care doesn't need another job fair. It needs leaders willing to solve root causes instead of endlessly filling empty positions. Thank you for listening to Empowering Healthcare, where transparency sparks transformation. Together, we can create safer systems, stronger teams, and better outcomes for those we serve.